He opened the front door, still on a business call, barking orders like always. But then he heard it, a tiny, trembling voice screaming from the living room. "Shut up! Just shut up! Stop yelling!" He froze. It was his adopted daughter. She wasn't talking to him. She was staring at something behind him, with tears streaming down her face. Before we begin, subscribe to our channel and comment where you are watching from, so we can bring more stories like these. The house always looked expensive from the outside, all glass edges and quiet luxury. But inside, it carried a silence that felt more like distance than peace. Jonathan Lyles moved through it like a man permanently late for something, tall, sharp-jawed, polished in his navy coat, a CEO whose shadow carried more presence than his voice ever offered at home. He lived in a world of meetings, deadlines, and people who feared him more than they respected him. Power was easy for him. Gentleness was not. And though he paid every bill, ran every check, he still hadn't learned how to talk to the little girl who lived down the hall. Lily was 8 years old, a tiny thing with soft brown hair that ran into her eyes when she hid behind it. She moved quietly through the hallways, almost like she didn't want to disturb the air. Trauma can make a child small. Her eyes held that soft, trembling sadness of someone who had seen something no child should ever see. Her biological parents had died in a fire, one she survived only because a neighbor pulled her out before the flames reached her. But the smoke wasn't the only thing she carried from that night. There were other sounds buried in her memory, sounds she never talked about, not even to the nanny. Jonathan thought silence was comfort. He thought providing a stable home was enough. He signed the adoption papers, believing a good environment could overwrite grief. And to his credit, he tried. He really did. He never meant to be cold. He never meant to be distant. He simply didn't know how to be anything else. His world was built on efficiency and structure. Lily's world needed softness and reassurance. Their lives ran parallel, never crashing, but never touching deeply either. Most mornings, she sat at the kitchen counter eating cereal quietly, while Jonathan paced the living room, phone pressed to his ear, voice hard and clipped. He never yelled at her, never even raised his voice near her intentionally. But yelling was a common thing in his line of work. Close the deal. Fix the report. Fire him. No, I said today. It was normal CEO language. But every time his tone sharpened, Lily's shoulders stiffened subtly, like someone bracing for impact. He never noticed. She always hid it well. Kids with trauma become experts at silence. The nanny, Mrs. Avery, tried to fill the emotional gaps. She tucked Lily in, made her laugh when she could, and gently redirected her away from loud rooms. Sometimes she would watch Jonathan with a kind of disappointed fondness, like she could see the dad he was trying to be, trapped under the man he'd taught himself to become. She often said things like, "Sir, she's sensitive," or "Sir, she startles easy." But Jonathan always nodded absent-mindedly, assuming it was just normal adjustment. He didn't connect it to anything deeper. He didn't know what fire trauma looked like. He didn't know what memories lived inside Lily's tiny chest. At night, the house grew cold. Not temperature cold, but emotionally cold. Jonathan stayed up late on his laptop, checking charts and replying to emails while Lily slept with the hallway light on, blanket tucked up to her chin, eyes half open, even in sleep. She never slept fully. She never trusted the darkness. Sometimes she would quietly get out of bed, walk to her door, sit on the floor, and listen for footsteps, just to make sure she wasn't alone. No one told Jonathan about those nights. Mrs. Avery didn't want to overwhelm him, and Lily didn't want to seem needy. Jonathan loved her in the only way he knew, by providing. He bought her the best clothes, the best tutors, the safest home, the newest toys. But children don't remember the price of the toys. They remember who sat beside them while they played. And Jonathan rarely did. He always planned to make time later, not realizing that later for a child is always too late. On the night everything broke, Jonathan walked into the house, already burning with stress, eyes sharp, jaw tight. The board meeting had exploded into chaos. A deal slipped through his fingers, and he carried all that frustration with him like a storm cloud. He stepped into the foyer, loosened his tie, and immediately answered another call, voice raised before he even shut the door behind him. His tone wasn't angry at Lily. It wasn't about her at all. But his voice filled the quiet house like thunder rolling through narrow halls. Upstairs, Lily sat on the floor coloring, humming softly to drown out the world. When she heard his voice cut through the silence, it wasn't the words. It was the tone, sharp, commanding, too loud, too strong. Her heart seized, her breathing stopped, her pencil dropped, and suddenly the walls around her weren't her room anymore. They were flames. They were smoke. They were the sound of a man yelling, 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 while she cried for her mother. Downstairs, Jonathan paced, unaware that each echo of his voice was triggering a memory that had never healed. He ended the call by practically barking into the phone. I said, close the deal right now. And that's when it happened. A scream cut through the mansion like a knife. A scream so raw, so desperate, it froze Jonathan where he stood. It wasn't a normal child's cry. It was a terrified, gut-wrenching plea ripped straight from the core of a nightmare. Before he could even register what was happening, Lily's voice shadowed the air. Shut up! Please stop! Jonathan spun around, heart pounding, confusion firing through his veins. He saw her at the top of the stairs, tiny hands clamped over her ears, body shaking so hard she could barely stand. Tears streamed down her face in panicked streaks, panic gripping every inch of her small frame. He reached for her instinctively, stepping forward with soft hands. But she recoiled instantly, stumbling backward like his touch was fire. He'd never seen fear like that, not directed at him. The nanny rushed behind Lily, kneeling beside her, whispering soft reassurances, rubbing her back. Her voice shook as she looked at Jonathan, not with anger, but with understanding he didn't yet have. Sir, she's not yelling at you, she said softly, heartbreak in every syllable. She's hearing someone else. Jonathan stood there, breath caught in his throat, completely still. Someone else? Someone else inside this house? Someone else inside her memory? The confusion twisted into fear, not of Lily, but for her, for what lived inside her tiny mind, for what his voice had dragged to the surface. He didn't understand yet, but he was about to. Jonathan didn't breathe for a moment, didn't even move, afraid that a single sound from him would shatter the girl trembling on the stairs. Lily's tiny shoulders jerked with every sob, her hands still wrapped tight around her ears, as if blocking out a storm only she could hear. He watched her body curl inward, watched her eyes dart around the room like the shadows themselves were yelling at her. And for the first time, in his perfectly controlled, meticulously structured life. Jonathan Miles felt completely powerless. He took a single step forward, slow and careful, but Lily flinched again. The fear in her eyes wasn't just fear. It was recognition. Recognition of something terrible, something old, something burned into her memory. Jonathan had seen fear in boardrooms, seen fear in hostile negotiations, seen fear in broken employees who expected to be fired. But this wasn't that. This was the fear of a child who had lived through something that still lived inside her. Mrs. Avery held Lily close, rocking her gently, her own eyes wet. She looked up at Jonathan only when Lily's shaking eased enough for her to breathe. "Sir, please," she whispered, her voice fragile. "Give her space." Jonathan backed away immediately, hands raised slightly, chest heavy with guilt he didn't yet fully understand. He had no idea how long he stood there, watching the nanny carry Lily back toward her room, whispering comforting words. His phone buzzed in his pocket. A notification, an email, something about quarterly projections. But the sound felt obscene in that moment. He didn't even reach for it. He waited in the hallway, unable to leave, unable to think about anything except the image of Lily screaming like she was reliving a nightmare. After what felt like forever, Mrs. Avery stepped out of the room and closed the door softly behind her. Her shoulders sagged, exhaustion written in every line of her face. Jonathan walked toward her slowly, afraid of what she might say, but more afraid of what she wouldn't. What was that?" he finally whispered, voice shaking more than he wanted it to. Mrs. Avery took a long breath, wiping her cheeks with the back of her hand. "Sir, she wasn't reacting to you," she said softly. "She was reacting to your voice." Jonathan blinked, confused. "My voice? I've never yelled at her." "It doesn't matter," she interrupted gently. "It's the yelling itself. Any yelling, any loud, sharp sound. It takes her back to the night of the fire." Jonathan froze. The night of the fire. The night she lost everything. Mrs. Avery lowered her gaze, as if choosing her words carefully. She hears yelling, and she thinks she's back in that burning house. She hears a man shouting, and she thinks she's about to lose someone again. She swallowed. She wasn't screaming at you. She was screaming at the memory. Jonathan felt something twist painfully in his chest, something tight and suffocating. He had known Lily was traumatized. Of course he did. But no one had ever said this. No one had explained that his presence, his voice, could be a trigger. "But I didn't know," he whispered, almost to himself. "I know," Mrs. Avery replied softly. "But she did." Jonathan felt his throat close. He stepped away, pacing toward the stairs, gripping the railing like he needed support. All the phone calls, all the meetings, all the late nights yelling into a headset. He thought he'd kept his two worlds separate. But Lily's world didn't separate danger from safety the way adults did. To her, the sound was the danger. Mrs. Avery walked deeper into the hallway, lowering her voice. She hides under tables when the gardener's leaf blower goes off. She cries herself to sleep if someone in the street shouts too loudly. She has nightmares almost every night. She hesitated. She thinks anger makes people disappear. Jonathan felt the blow like a physical strike to the chest. Disappear, like her parents had. "And your voice?" Mrs. Avery added gently. "Your voice is deep, commanding. When you raise it, even if it's not at her, she hears him." Jonathan turned his head slowly, eyes darkening. Him. Who? Mrs. Avery hesitated again, then whispered, "Her biological father." Jonathan stared. "She never told you," she continued. "But the night of the fire, there was yelling, a lot of it, screaming, fighting. Her father was drunk, angry, violent. And when the fire started, she heard him yelling until she didn't anymore." Jonathan felt the room tilt. He reached for the wall, steadying himself. His voice, his yelling, his tone. He'd been dragging her back into the worst memory of her life. Mrs. Avery placed a gentle hand on his arm. "She's not afraid of you, sir. She's afraid of what your voice reminds her of." Jonathan nodded shakily, breath short. "I didn't know," he repeated, voice breaking. "No one is blaming you," she said, "but now you do know." And knowing was worse than anything he'd imagined. Mrs. Avery guided him toward the home office. "There's something you need to listen to," she said softly. Jonathan followed, body numb, as she walked to his desk and pointed toward the tablet sitting on the wood surface. The screen was still lit, audio paused at the edge of a waveform spike. He frowned slightly, confused. Mrs. Avery pressed play. A man's voice erupted from the speakers, loud and furious, slurring curses and screaming incoherent threats. Something crashed in the background. A woman cried. A child screamed. Jonathan's pulse spiked instantly. It wasn't him. It wasn't his voice. But he heard the similarity in the tone, the fury, the volume, the intensity. "This was recorded the night of the fire," Mrs. Avery whispered. Jonathan clutched the edge of the desk, feeling sick. Why is this here?" "Lily keeps it hidden," Mrs. Avery said. "She doesn't listen to it on purpose, but sometimes she thinks she hears something, so she checks it. To remind herself she survived." Jonathan covered his mouth with a trembling hand. The audio continued. Screams, crashing, panic. And Jonathan stopped it with shaking fingers. The silence afterward felt heavier than the sound. "That's what she hears when anyone yells," Mrs. Avery murmured. "That's what her memory pulls up." Jonathan slowly sank into the office chair, head in his hands. Every piece of his identity, his power, his authority, his confidence, crumbling under a truth he never imagined he'd face. The CEO, who commanded entire cities with a single word, couldn't control the one thing that terrified his daughter. And now he finally understood what he had done. He hadn't raised his voice at her, but he had hurt her anyway. His phone buzzed again. He didn't look at it, because for the first time in his life, Jonathan Miles had one priority. Just one. Fix the damage he never meant to cause. Jonathan wasn't sure how long he stayed in that chair, staring at the blurred reflection of himself in the dark computer screen. His own face looked unfamiliar. Eyes wild with guilt, jaw clenched hard enough to tremble. The image of a man who'd conquered every financial battle, but had no idea how to fight the one that mattered. Down the hallway, he heard a faint sniff. Lily, hiding in her room, curled somewhere small, trying to make herself invisible again. The weight of that realization crushed him. He stood slowly, as though any sudden movement might shatter the fragile air in the house. For once, his footsteps didn't echo with authority. They were hesitant, almost apologetic, carrying him toward the soft glow leaking under Lily's door. Mrs. Avery had left a small nightlight on, its warm beams spilling across the hallway carpet. Jonathan paused, steadying himself. His hand hovered near the doorknob, then dropped. He couldn't force his way in. Not after what she'd just lived through. So he knelt instead, outside her door, on the carpet. The same man who had entire industries waiting for his call lowered himself quietly to the floor, like a beggar seeking forgiveness. He rested his palm flat against the wood. "Lily?" he whispered, voice small, gentle, steady. "It's Gaddy." No answer. Not even a rustle inside. Jonathan pressed his forehead to the door, eyes shutting tight. "I'm not here to talk loud," he said softly. "I'm not here to make noise. I'm here, okay? I'm right here." A quiet creak came from inside. Barely a shift, barely a breath. "You didn't do anything wrong," he whispered. "I scared you. I scared you because I wasn't thinking about how my voice sounds. I didn't understand, and I should have." Still silence. Jonathan exhaled deeply. "When your mom and dad passed away, you lost a whole world. I know I can't replace them. I know I can't undo what happened." His throat tightened painfully. "I promise you, Lily, I'm not going anywhere." A soft hiccup from inside. A tiny sound, but enough to make his heart nearly collapse. He kept talking, slow and steady. "You don't have to open the door. You don't have to come to me. I'm not asking for anything." His voice broke. "I'm asking for your forgiveness, but you don't owe me that either. I just want you to know I hear you now. Really hear you." The hallway felt like a sanctuary. Quiet, dim, sacred. He stayed kneeling, even when his knees began to ache. Stayed, even when the house went silent again. "Lily," he whispered, "I'm sorry for every loud call, for every time I scared you, for not knowing, for not seeing." His voice trembled. "I don't want to be the reason you remember pain." The doorknob turned, just slightly. Jonathan froze, breath catching. Slowly, the door cracked open a few inches. A small eye peeked out, red and swollen, lashes wet. Lily looked at him like she wasn't sure if he was real. He dropped his gaze instantly, lowering his head even more. He didn't want to tower over her. Didn't want to be a shadow. "Hi, sweetheart," he whispered, barely above a breath. Her voice came out shaky. Are you still mad?" Jonathan's eyes burned. "No," he said instantly. "I'm not mad. Not at you. Not ever." She opened the door a little more, enough for her little body to slip into view. She wore her pink pajamas, the ones with cartoon bears, sleeves too long for her tiny arms. Her fingers twisted nervously at the fabric. "Are you gonna yell again?" she whispered. Jonathan shook his head, slowly, deliberately. "No, never again, not like that." Lily swallowed, glancing toward the office down the hall. "But you sounded like him." Jonathan felt the breath leave his lungs. "I know," he said, voice cracking, "and I'm so sorry." She shifted closer, cautious, but pulled by something. Curiosity, maybe hope. She reached out and placed her small hand on top of his, just barely touching his skin. Jonathan stopped breathing entirely. I don't want you to disappear," she whispered, tears sliding down her cheeks again. "Daddy disappeared when he yelled. Mommy disappeared when he yelled. I don't want you to disappear too." Jonathan broke. Not loudly, not dramatically, but his face crumpled. And tears slipped down his cheeks silently, the way grown men cry when they don't know how to be strong anymore. "Oh, sweetheart," he whispered, pulling her hand gently into both of his. "I'm here. I'm right here. I'm not disappearing. Not ever." She stepped forward and wrapped her arms around his neck, clinging to him like he was the last safe thing in the world. Jonathan hugged her gently, careful not to squeeze too tight, careful not to breathe too loud. holding her as though she were made of glass and fire at the same time. "I'm sorry," he whispered into her hair again and again, each apology softer than the last. "Daddy's here. Daddy's here." Mrs. Avery wiped her own tears from the corner of the hallway, stepping back quietly to give them space. Jonathan lifted Lily in his arms, slow, gentle, and carried her inside the room. He sat on the edge of her bed, rocking her the same way the nanny had earlier. Her tiny head rested on his chest, ear pressed against his heartbeat. "You're safe with me," he murmured. "Always." Lily nodded weakly. "You promise?" "With my whole heart, baby," he whispered. She closed her eyes, finally drifting into sleep. Fingers still curled around the fabric of his shirt, as if one wrong sound would send her spiraling again. Jonathan didn't put her down. He didn't move from that spot all night. He sat there holding the fragile, brave little girl who had survived fire and loss, and still found the courage to open the door for him. And in that dim, quiet room, Jonathan finally understood something he had never understood before. Power doesn't come from raising your voice. It comes from lowering it for the people who need softness. He brushed a strand of hair off her forehead and whispered one last promise to the sleeping child in his arms. "I'm going to learn how to be the father you deserve." And for the first time in a long, long time, Jonathan Miles meant every single word he spoke. The next morning crept in quietly, the kind of soft sunrise that barely touched the curtains. Jonathan hadn't slept. His back ached, his neck stiffened, but he didn't move, not even when the first bit of light brushed across Lily's small, peaceful face. She was still asleep in his arms. For a moment, Jonathan allowed himself to simply watch her, the rise and fall of her breaths, the way her tiny fingers were still clutching the fabric of his shirt. Last night had shaken him to the core, but this morning felt different. The house was calm. No phone vibrating, no emails, no board members demanding his time, just him and his daughter, a word he finally understood. A quiet knock tapped the open doorframe. Mrs. Avery stood there, hands clasped, eyes soft. "Good morning, sir. May I?" Jonathan nodded gently. She stepped inside, lowering her voice so it wouldn't wake Lily. "I made some tea downstairs. You look like you've been through a war." Jonathan gave a tired half smile. "Feels like it." Mrs. Avery glanced at the sleeping child, her expression tender. "And she looks like she finally rested for the first time in weeks." Those words hit him hard. "Weeks?" The nanny hesitated, chewing the inside of her cheek. "Sir, there are things you don't know, things Lily's been carrying by herself." Jonathan's chest tightened. He carefully laid Lily down, tucking the blanket around her. She murmured, reaching for him instinctively. He placed a soft kiss on her forehead before stepping out with the nanny. Downstairs, the kitchen felt unfamiliar, quiet, gentle, stripped of its usual hurried atmosphere. Mrs. Avery poured him tea as he sat rigid, bracing himself. Her hands trembled slightly as she stirred the sugar. "Sir, you need to understand something about trauma, especially hers." Jonathan swallowed. "Tell me everything." She took a breath. Lily's biological father was a violent man, not just angry, violent. Her mother tried to leave many times, but fear can trap a person. On the night of the fire, they were arguing. Loud, terrifyingly loud. Lily heard it all. Jonathan's grip on his mug tightened until his knuckles whitened. He shouted for hours. Mrs. Avery continued, voice heavy with memories Lily had shared through tears. threw things, broke dishes. And when the fight spilled into the kitchen, something caught fire. Her mother tried to save her, to pull her out. But the fire spread faster than she could. Jonathan stared at the table, heart pounding painfully. The firefighters told me she was hiding under a bed when they found her. Small, curled up, hands over her ears. The nanny's voice cracked. Just like last night. Jonathan felt his throat close. He saw it now, Lily crouched on her bedroom floor, shaking, begging the yelling to stop. He hadn't been yelling at her, but he might as well have been. Mrs. Avery continued softly. When children live through something like that, their minds get stuck in certain moments. Loud voices, arguments, slamming doors. They pull her back into that burning house. Jonathan's eyes stung. And every time you came home, shouting on the phone, she whispered. Lily flinched. Every single time. Jonathan's breath itched. Why? Why didn't she say anything? Why didn't you tell me? Mrs. Avery wiped her eyes. Because trauma is a shadow, sir. It hides. She didn't want to upset you. She didn't want to seem ungrateful. And you, she hesitated, you weren't listening. Not really. He bowed his head, shame washing over him. Mrs. Avery placed a gentle hand on his arm, something she'd never dared to do before. You're not a bad man, Jonathan, just a busy one. You were doing your best with the tools you had, but now you know better, and now you can do better. Jonathan swallowed hard. I want to. I don't care what it takes. The nanny nodded, relief flooding her features. Then there are steps we can take. First, no yelling in the house, not even in another room. Her brain doesn't understand distance, only volume. He nodded fiercely. No slammed doors, no raised voices from staff. And sir, she paused, you need to slow down. Not just for her, for yourself. He exhaled shakily. I canceled my meetings. Mrs. Avery blinked in surprise. All of them? Every single one, he said quietly. This house, this family. She's my priority now. A soft sound drifted from upstairs, Lily waking. Jonathan stood instantly. She's probably scared, he whispered, fear gripping him again. Mrs. Avery smiled gently. Not this time. Jonathan returned upstairs, heart thudding with a mix of anxiety and hope. Lily sat on her bed, hugging her stuffed bunny, eyes searching the room. When she saw him in the doorway, her shoulders relaxed. You stayed, she whispered. I promised, he said, stepping inside slowly. She nodded, small smile appearing, tiny, but real. Are you going to yell today? She asked, her voice fragile. Jonathan knelt in front of her. No, sweetheart. I'm learning how to talk soft, for you. She studied him, like she was trying to read his soul. Mrs. Avery said, you're gonna try really hard. I am, he said, placing a hand over his heart. Not just try, I'm going to change. Her little fingers reached out, brushing the side of his cheek. I believe you, she whispered. Jonathan felt something inside him break open, not in pain, but in healing. And then Lily leaned forward and wrapped her arms around his neck, hugging him without fear, without hesitation. He held her gently, mindful, careful, present. Not the CEO, not the executive, just a father. He rocked her slowly, breathing in her small warmth. I'm here, he whispered again, for good. Lily smiled into his shoulder. Jonathan felt something he hadn't felt in years. Peace. For the first time, he wasn't thinking about deals, mergers, deadlines, or numbers. Just her, just being the safe place she had lost, just being the father she needed. And silently, he made a vow. He would never let his voice be her fear again. He would be the calm she could run to, not the storm she hid from. The house felt different already, and Jonathan Miles, once a titan of business, felt himself becoming something far more important. A gentle man, a present father, a promise she could trust. Jonathan didn't remember the last time he cried. Not like this. Not with his whole body trembling. Not with the kind of grief that felt like it had claws. It started quietly that night after Lily fell asleep. A soft sound in his chest that grew heavier, tighter, until he finally pressed his palms into his eyes and let every buried emotion spill out. He didn't cry for himself. He cried for her, for the little girl who flinched at the sound of his voice, for the child who carried ghosts in her ears, for the moments he missed, the signs he ignored, the pain he accidentally repeated. When the tears finally dried, something inside him felt scraped clean, raw, exposed, but honest. That night, he did something no one in his company had ever seen him do. He grabbed his phone, opened his calendar, and cleared everything. Red lines crossed meetings, canceled conferences, postponed negotiations. Every ping of "Are you sure?" was answered with the same response: yes. He shut the phone off completely and placed it in the drawer of his nightstand, burying the very tool that had consumed his life for 20 years. Then he sat by Lily's bed again, not because she asked, but because he needed to. Hours slipped by. He didn't sleep. He watched her breathe, watched her twitch into dreams, watched her tiny hand wander until it found his arm and rested there. Even half asleep, she searched for safety, and he stayed. Quiet, still, present. When the first rays of dawn touched the window, Jonathan finally understood something he had been too blind to see. A father isn't someone who provides the roof. A father is the roof. The next morning, Mrs. Avery peeked into the room and gasped softly. Jonathan was sitting on the edge of the bed, one hand gently combing through Lily's hair, humming a soft tune, off-key, unsure, but full of effort. "Sir, you're still here?" she whispered. Jonathan didn't look up. "I'm not going anywhere." Lily blinked awake, eyes swollen from last night's tears. When she saw Jonathan still sitting there, her lips curled into a small, tired smile. "You didn't leave," she whispered. "I told you," he said, softly. "I'm learning." And for the first time, she believed him. Later that day, when Lily ate breakfast at the kitchen island, Jonathan paced the dining room, rehearsing what he needed to say. He'd faced Congress, shareholders, and international press, but none of them had made his palms sweat like this. After breakfast, he called Mrs. Avery into the living room. "I need help," he said simply. She blinked. "Help with what, sir?" "With Lily," he said. "With being the kind of father she needs. I don't know how to do this alone." Mrs. Avery's eyes softened. "That's the first step, sir. Realizing you don't have to." So she sat him down and began explaining trauma-sensitive parenting. Slowly, gently, the way she wished someone had taught Lily's biological parents. Jonathan listened like his life depended on it. He learned that trauma wasn't something a child could get over. It lived inside the body, in the ears, in the heartbeat, in the way Lily froze every time someone raised their voice. He learned that yelling wasn't just loud, it was danger. It was fire. It was sirens in her mind. He learned that Lily didn't speak up because kids who've endured loss don't ask for comfort. They just expect it to disappear again. And as he listened, Jonathan felt guilt tighten around him like a fist. How many nights had she quietly endured his storms? How many mornings had she tiptoed around him, hoping today wouldn't be loud? How many moments had he unknowingly pulled her back into the burning house she escaped? But instead of sinking into shame, he looked at the nanny and said 4 words no one expected from a billionaire CEO. "What do I do?" Mrs. Avery handed him a pamphlet. "First step, therapy, for both of you." He nodded instantly. "And," she added, "you must change the environment. No yelling, no loud alarms, no aggressive music. Peace must be the rule." He swallowed hard. "Done." "And lastly," she said with a tender smile, "speak softly. Even when you're frustrated, even when you're busy, even when you're tired." He closed his eyes for a moment, nodding again. "I can do that." When Lily entered the room, clutching her bunny, Jonathan approached her slowly, carefully, as if approaching something fragile and holy. "Sweetheart," he said in the softest voice Lily had ever heard him use, "we're gonna make things different now." Lily looked up skeptically. "No yelling," he continued, kneeling. "Not from me, not from anyone, ever again." She studied him with those big, searching eyes, the ones that had seen more flames than childhood. After a moment, she nodded and wrapped her arms around his neck in a quiet hug he would remember for the rest of his life. Jonathan kept his word immediately. He called his assistant. "Clear my schedule until further notice." He informed the company he was stepping away from day-to-day operations. He told the board he needed time. And for the first time in their relationship, they heard a version of Jonathan they didn't recognize. Calm, gentle, steady. His assistant stuttered. "Sir, is everything okay?" Jonathan looked over at Lily drawing with crayons on the living room floor, humming softly to herself. "Yes," he whispered. "For the first time, it will be." The staff in the house were the first to notice the change. They whispered to each other, stunned, after Jonathan spoke to the gardener in a level, kind tone, instead of the clipped commands he usually gave. "The lion's been tamed," one joked. "No," another corrected. "The lion learned who he was roaring at." Jonathan didn't care what they said. All he cared about was the little girl, sitting cross-legged with her crayons, finally smiling again. Oh. That night, he sat by her bed again. No business calls, no shouting, no blinking screens, just storytelling. His voice soft, slow, merely trembling with emotion. Lily fought sleep, her eyelids fluttering as she leaned against him. "Daddy," she whispered. His heart melted. She hadn't called him that in weeks. "Yes, baby?" "Thank you for being quiet." He kissed the top of her head. "Thank you for being brave." As she drifted off, he felt her tiny hand searching for his again, resting softly on his arm. And in the gentle silence of that darkened room, Jonathan Miles, the man who controlled empires and silenced boardrooms, finally understood the power of a whisper. He didn't need to roar to protect her. He just needed to love her loud enough to never raise his voice again. Jonathan woke the next morning before the sun, not because of work emails or a buzzing phone, but because habit had trained him to rise early. But this morning felt different. No pressure, no frenzy, just a quiet room and the soft sound of Lily breathing in the next room. For the first time in decades, he didn't feel chained to a schedule. He felt present. He sat on the edge of his bed, rubbing his hands over his face, letting the reality sink in. Life would not go back to what it was. Not his life, not hers, not their home. He walked downstairs, and the silence hit him, different from the cold silence that used to fill the halls. This silence felt peaceful, like a house finally exhaling after holding its breath for too long. Mrs. Avery was in the kitchen, preparing breakfast. When she saw him, she blinked twice, unsure how to greet this new version of him. "Good morning, sir." Jonathan shook his head gently. "It's just Jonathan today." Her eyes widened, and she nodded, a soft smile forming. He grabbed a plate and helped her set the table. She kept glancing at him like he was a ghost wearing Jonathan's face. "Sir, Jonathan, do you want your coffee?" she asked. He hesitated, then shook his head. "No phone, no calls, no caffeine rush. I'm slowing down." She smiled again. She'll feel that. Kids know when the air changes. When Lily wandered into the kitchen, hair messy from sleep, eyes half closed, she stopped when she saw him. "You're here," she whispered. "I am," he said with a gentle smile, "and I'm not going anywhere today." Her shoulders relaxed instantly. After breakfast, Jonathan made a call, not to a client, not to a partner, but to a child therapist recommended by Mrs. Avery. He booked sessions for Lily twice a week. "And for you as well, Mr. Miles," the therapist said kindly. Jonathan exhaled. "Yes, for me." It felt strange, admitting he needed help, but necessary. Later that morning, when one of the housemaids accidentally dropped a dish, the sound echoed loudly through the kitchen. Everyone turned toward Jonathan, bracing for the explosion that once defined him. But instead, he took a slow breath and said softly, "Accidents happen. Just be careful, okay?" The maid blinked, stunned. Mrs. Avery nearly dropped her spoon, and Lily, standing beside him, smiled shyly, like she'd just watched her world shift 1 inch toward safety. That smile alone made the effort worth everything. By noon, Jonathan had made his biggest decision yet. He called his board of directors to arrange an emergency meeting. Not on Zoom, not through email, but in person. They gathered in the private conference room of his home, whispering among themselves, confused and curious. Jonathan entered the room calmly, a far cry from the storm they were used to. One board member stood. "Jonathan, are you okay? You've canceled international meetings. There are multi-million-dollar deals waiting." Jonathan nodded. "They can wait." Murmurs filled the room. He raised a hand. "Yesterday, my daughter was traumatized by my behavior. My voice, my anger, my absence. She thought I was turning into the man who hurt her before the fire that killed her parents. And I didn't even know." The room fell silent. "I am stepping down as CEO," he said. Gasps erupted. "Stepping down? Jonathan, that's insane. We need you." He shook his head. "My daughter needs me more." One man, a longtime partner, tried to protest. "Your company is your legacy." Jonathan looked him dead in the eyes. "Lily is my legacy." Even the room couldn't argue with that. By the end of the meeting, Jonathan had arranged to transition into a partial advisory role, giving up day-to-day control. It was the first time in his life he put family above business. After the meeting ended, he walked upstairs, feeling lighter than he had in years. Lily was in the living room, coloring quietly, humming a tune from a lullaby Mrs. Avery taught her. He sat beside her. "Sweetheart, guess what?" She looked up. "What?" "I'm going to be home more now. A lot more." Her eyes lit up like sunrise breaking through clouds. "Really?" "Really," he said, gently brushing a curl from her forehead. She climbed into his lap, without hesitation. It was such a small gesture, but to Jonathan, it felt like being forgiven. The rest of the week, Jonathan transformed the house, piece by piece. He replaced the blaring alarm system with gentle chimes. He asked staff to speak softly around Lily. He installed soundproofing in his home office, not to hide his anger, but to make sure raised voices would never echo in this house again. He even changed his ringtone to a soothing melody Lily picked. He spent afternoons baking cookies with her in the kitchen, burning the first few batches and laughing in the softest voice she'd ever heard from him. They built blanket forts in the living room. They planted flowers in the garden. They read books slowly, with Jonathan doing silly voices he didn't know he had. Mrs. Avery watched them with teary eyes, whispering to herself, "This is the home she deserved." One evening during a therapy session, Lily admitted something that broke Jonathan again, but in a healing way this time. She said softly, "I thought if you kept yelling, you'd disappear like my old daddy." Jonathan swallowed a hard lump. He reached for her hand. "I'm not disappearing," he whispered. "Not now, not ever." Therapy became a ritual. Healing became a lifestyle. And Jonathan, who once built skyscrapers and crushed negotiations, learned how to speak quietly, love loudly, and live slowly. Little by little, the house shifted from a mansion to a home. One night, as Lily slept against his chest during a movie, Jonathan realized something profound. He'd spent years shouting commands, giving orders, building empires. But none of those accomplishments could compare to this. A little girl breathing peacefully because he finally chose to be gentle. And in that moment, Jonathan understood something deeper than any business lesson he'd ever learned. Power might build worlds, but gentleness saves them. Jonathan found himself cherishing the small moments now. The things he used to walk past without noticing. The soft hum Lily made when she colored. The way she whispered good morning, like she wasn't sure she was allowed to be loud yet. The gentle tap of her feet as she walked around the house, testing the air like a child learning how to trust again. And slowly, he noticed something else. She wasn't flinching as much. She wasn't hiding when a door closed. She wasn't scanning the room for danger every time someone spoke. Little by little, she was breathing like a child again. One evening, the sky outside blushed into shades of lavender and soft gold. Jonathan had just finished tidying up the kitchen with Lily, something he'd never imagined enjoying, and they moved into the living room, where her crayons were scattered across the table. "Daddy," Lily said quietly, "I made something for you." Jonathan felt his heart skip. She rarely initiated things like this. "For me?" She nodded and picked up a folded sheet of thick white paper. She held it with both hands like it was fragile, precious, sacred. Jonathan sat beside her on the sofa, letting her climb onto his lap like it was the most natural thing in the world. "Can I open it?" he asked softly. She nodded again. He opened the paper carefully, and for a few seconds, he couldn't breathe. It was a drawing, but not like the usual stick figures and hearts children make. On the left side of the page was a house drawn with dark crayons, flames licking the windows, black smoke curling into the sky. Inside, through a small scribbled window, was a tiny figure curled up, hands over her ears. Lily. His throat tightened painfully, and on the right side of the page was another house, bright yellow, warm, glowing. It had big windows, a garden full of flowers, and a porch. In front of it stood two figures, a small girl holding the hand of a taller man, Lily and him. At the top, she had written, slow, uneven, but full of intention, "The house I lost, and the house you saved." Jonathan's vision blurred instantly. His throat burned. He pressed the drawing to his chest, his hand trembling as he looked at her. "Lily," he whispered, voice cracking as gently as his heart. She watched him with wide, curious eyes. "Do you like it?" He swallowed a sob and managed, I love it. More than anything you've ever given me. She leaned her head against his shoulder. I made it because you don't yell anymore, and you stay, and you tell me when you're leaving, and you tell me when you're coming back, and I don't get scared as much. She paused. It feels like this house is safe. Jonathan couldn't hold back anymore. He wrapped both arms around her, pulling her into his chest, holding her with a kind of love he didn't know how to show before. Come here, baby, he whispered, kissing the top of her head. Come here. She hugged him back just as tightly. Jonathan's tears fell onto her hair, silent, steady. He breathed through the ache in his chest until he could speak again. You saved me too, he finally whispered. Lily lifted her head. How? He brushed a thumb over her cheek. I didn't know how to slow down, he said softly. Didn't know how to listen. Didn't know how to be gentle. I forgot what mattered. His voice trembled. You taught me. You made me want to be better. She studied him, eyes full of innocence and old pain. You're not going to yell again, right? Never, he whispered. Not ever. She leaned her forehead against his. Okay. And just like that, the last wall between them disappeared. Jonathan held her long after she fell asleep, her small hands still gripping his shirt, like she was afraid he might vanish if she let go. He carried her to bed, tucking her in with the softest care. He lingered there for a moment, brushing a strand of hair from her face. Then he whispered, Thank you for giving me a second chance. He walked out of her room and sat alone on the hallway floor, the drawing still clutched in his hands. He stared at it for a long time, the burnt house, the glowing house, the two figures standing in the new doorway. It hit him harder than any business failure or professional setback ever had. She wasn't asking for toys. She wasn't asking for money. She wasn't asking for the world he built in the clouds. She was asking for peace. She was asking for presence. She was asking for gentleness. And for the first time, Jonathan knew exactly how to give her all of it. He folded the drawing carefully and placed it in the inside pocket of his jacket. He planned to keep it there forever. A reminder, a vow, a promise tattooed onto paper, a promise he would never break. The house felt different now, not because anything physical had changed, but because the air itself seemed softer, warmer, safer. It no longer echoed with the sharpness of Jonathan's voice or the emptiness of silence, pretending to be peace. It felt like a home finally remembering what love sounded like. That night, after Lily brushed her teeth and climbed into bed, Bunny tucked under her arm, hair still slightly damp from her bath, she looked up at Jonathan with sleepy eyes. Daddy, she whispered, can you read me the one about the stars? He smiled, pulling the chair closer to her bedside. Of course. His voice floated gently, warm and low, as he read the story about constellations and the children who talked to the sky. Lily's eyelids fluttered, her breathing slowing into the soft rhythm of safety. Jonathan kept reading long after she drifted off, not because she needed it, but because he needed the moment. He closed the book quietly and leaned down, placing a soft kiss on her forehead. He pulled the blanket a little higher, tucking it around her like a shield. As he stood in the doorway, watching her sleep peacefully in the dim glow of the nightlight, something stirred deep inside him, a quiet revelation. That night, after Lily brushed her teeth and climbed into bed, Bunny tucked under her arm, hair still slightly damp from her bath. She looked up at Jonathan with sleepy eyes. Daddy, she whispered, can you read me the one about the stars? He smiled, pulling the chair closer to her bedside. Of course. His voice floated gently, worn and low, as he read the story about constellations and the children who talk to the sky. Lily's eyelids fluttered, her breathing slowing into the soft rhythm of safety. Jonathan kept reading long after she drifted off, not because she needed it, but because he needed the moment. He closed the book quietly and leaned down, placing a soft kiss on her forehead. He pulled the blanket a little higher, tucking it around her like a shield. As he stood in the doorway, watching her sleep peacefully in the dim glow of the nightlight, something stirred deep inside him, a quiet revelation. He didn't recognize the man he used to be, the man who barked into phones, the man who slammed doors, the man who mistook loudness for strength. That man had been powerful in the world's eyes and powerless in his own home. He stepped into the hallway, leaving the door cracked open just enough for the soft light to spill out. Then he walked to the living room, where the city's skyline glittered through the windows. Once the symbol of everything he chased, now just a reminder of everything he almost lost. He sank onto the couch, elbows resting on his knees, hands clasped together as he stared at nothing and everything at once. A quiet truth formed inside him, steady and clear. Sometimes we think we're protecting the people we love with our success, when all they wanted was our gentleness. The thought made his chest tighten with something that felt both painful and beautiful. He remembered the first day he adopted Lily, how small she looked in that big courthouse hallway, how she held on to her social worker's sleeve like it was a lifeline. He'd promised himself he'd give her the world, a bigger world than she'd ever known. He didn't realize back then that the greatest gift wasn't a mansion or money or private schools. It was a quiet house, soft voices, steady hands, peace she could trust. He had learned it the hardest way, through her fear. And now he would spend the rest of his life rewriting every memory she was forced to carry. Jonathan leaned back on the couch, eyes closed, letting the silence wrap around him. Not the cold silence of before, but the warm hush of a home where a child finally slept without fear. A soft voice echoed in his mind, the therapist's words from their last session. Children who've lived through trauma don't need perfect parents. They need consistent ones, gentle ones. He whispered into the quiet room, as if saying it to himself and the walls and any ghosts still lingering in the corners. I choose gentle every day. He let the words settle, feeling them anchor into something inside him. He stood, walked back to Lily's room, and looked at her again, arms relaxed, face peaceful, breaths even. She wasn't gripping her blanket like she used to. She wasn't curled into a tiny ball of fear. She looked free. Watching her sleep, he felt a slow smile form, the kind that came from deep acceptance, not obligation. You saved me too, sweetheart, he whispered into the doorway. More than you'll ever know. He turned off the hallway light and headed to his own room. Before turning in, he reached for the folded drawing in his jacket pocket, the one with flames on one side, warm light on the other. He stared at it for a long time. It wasn't just her story, it was his too. He placed it inside a small frame on his nightstand, right beside a picture of them at the beach from earlier that summer, her on his shoulders, both of them laughing. He wanted it there. He needed it there. A reminder that every sunrise brought him another chance to be softer than yesterday. As he turned off the lamp, the room dimmed into quiet gold, and the final thoughts flowed through him like a voiceover, written straight for the hearts of your viewers. Sometimes we break the people we're trying to protect, not with our hands, but with our voices. But the truth is, gentleness can rebuild what anger destroys. Fade out moment. Jonathan returns to Lily's room one last time, tucks the blanket around her, whispers a lullaby off-key but full of love. The camera pulls back slowly. First, the hallway. Then the warm lights in the house. Then the dark city outside. A contrast. Cold world, warm home. Text fades onto the screen. It's not money that makes you a parent. It's gentleness. Black screen. Dot.